Hello. Today we're going to cast our level 9 lens on a Mrs. Birling, the Queen of Mean. This is a woman who's turned heartlessness into an art form. She's got real hatred, lace rate and contempt for the working class. Anyway, we're going to look at 3 things that this lassie says and get a sense of her character from that. And perhaps also, more importantly, a sense of how Priestley is using that character to convey his political and social messages. I'll also stitch in some winning context. I know examiners expect you to do that these days. So, what's occurring? Mrs. Birling, wouldn't you like to know? Now, early on in Act 1, where it's all pink lighting and a complacent atmosphere of celebration, Mrs. Birling rolls out a line of dialogue that reveals a lot about her unpalatable nature. Now, hopefully, the only thing that I've got in common with Mr. Birling is that we both like a good dinner. And he suggests praising the cook whilst he's in the presence of a guest, Gerald Croft. Well, Mrs. Birling, the patron saint of snooty, she tells him off for this, doesn't she? She kind of gently reprimands him and says, "Oh, Arthur, you shouldn't say such things." Now, if we want to earn the love, the respect, and let's be honest, more importantly, the level 9 off an examiner, we do well, wherever possible, to lay on 2 interpretations for our piddly bit of evidence. The exam board mark scheme says that the top band essays will reveal a perceptive understanding and interpretation of evidence. Well, hold on to your hair clips, because perceptive interpretation is just what you're going to get from Mrs. Birling's quotation here. Now, one way of reading this line is that it tells us something about Mrs. Birling's marriage. What it reinforces, this line, is that she is her husband's social superior. And that's a line that appears in the stage directions at the start of the play. Mrs. Birling has a solid knowledge of manners or social etiquette. I mean, clearly it is not the done thing, old chap, to praise the catering staff in front of guests. So that's one thing it rams home, the fact that Mr. Birling lacks the kind of social polish, the upper class veneer that his wife has. And to show the examiner that we're not exactly defective in the perceptive department, let's roll out that second interpretation now. "Oh, Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." What that is doing is giving us an insight into Mrs. Birling's value system, her core beliefs, her hierarchy of priorities, if you will. Think about this. Later on in the play, Act 2 and 3, Mrs. Birling shows very little concern for the plight of the poor, accepts no blame for the death of Eva Smith. So, working class girls dying in grinding agony and poverty, not her problem, not her concern, couldn't give 2 toots. But following social codes of behaviour, observing those rules of social etiquette, manners, that very much is her focus. And what that's doing is just amplifying to us what a heartless, shallow character Priestley has crafted her to be. What we'll do now is fuse together this analysis of Mrs. Birling with some juicy context. Mrs. Birling, as you know, is a symbol or cipher of the ruling class or the bourgeoisie. Use those 2 terms interchangeably at GCSE, doesn't matter. Now, why does Priestley wish to depict these people through the character of Mrs. Birling as shallow and superficial? Well, shut your yapper and I'll tell you, it serves his socialist purpose, his quest to make Britain a fairer society. If he can depict these people in a negative light, it's like he's saying to his 1945 audience, look, these rulers are capitalist masters. They've got a malformed, they've got a deformed, they've got a corrupt set of values. They do not care about you and the suffering of the poor. They're more concerned about where the blinking fish fork goes on the table. Manners, not the moral obligation to look after the vulnerable. So, by depicting the ruling class of 1912 in this way, and by extension the ruling class in general, Priestley says these people prioritise manners, appearances, style over substance, and are unfit to rule, unfit to govern. This second quotation that we'll look at from Mrs. Birling, the Queen of Mean, comes from Act 2. She says it a couple of times, I think. Referring to working class women, she refers to them as girls of that class. Girls of that class. And we can infer from this line the toxic prejudices, the offensive stereotypes that Mrs. Birling harbours towards the working class. I mean, She can't believe that Eva refused stolen money. According to Mrs. Birling, and we can infer this from this line, the poor have got no morals. You know, they're all grasping, greedy degenerates who have the pennies from your pocket as soon as look at you. This is ironic or strange, of course, because Priestley suggests in the play that it is the ruling class that are dishonest, that are immoral. I mean, look at all the sins they commit towards Eva. This line then showcases Mrs. Birling's base view of the poor, and that is a view at odds with the reality of Eva Smith. Let's drill down a bit deeper into these prejudices that are revealed in Mrs. Birling's line of dialogue, girls of that class. It's a false assumption, of course, but I think we can very fruitfully analyse why Mrs. Birling clings so doggedly, you know, like a drowning man to a lifebelt, why she clings so doggedly to these prejudices. Because I would argue that she has to see the poor this way if she wants to hold on to her wealth and avoid pangs of guilt. What am I on about? Well, pin back your ears and listen. So long as Mrs. Birling continues to perceive the poor as immoral, you know, they're always drinking and thieving and having too many children, she can keep her money in her pocket. As long as she thinks that the poor's behaviour or misbehaviour contributes to poverty, causes poverty, she's going to feel no moral compulsion, no social duty to help them out. But imagine for 1 second that you could disabuse Mrs. Birling of these nasty assumptions, these toxic prejudices. What then? Well, do you know what? She might start to pondering the real reasons for poverty, and she might come at the same conclusion as J.B. Priestley, that it is the ruling class and their exploitative practices, them exploiting the bajingo out of the poor, you know, cutting their paying conditions down to the bone, that is what creates and perpetuates poverty. So, Mrs. Birling, she's going to cling to those prejudices, thank you very much, just as long as she's got breath in her body and money in her bank. Here's a strange one for you, a real contextual curio. Now, I'll say now, if you don't understand this one and you don't like it, forget about it, drop it like a hot snot, it doesn't matter. But examiners will love this because it's so unusual and interesting. Get this right, 1943, Priestley writes this great spy novel, a thriller called Blackout in Gretly. And it involves this British Secret Service agent trying to identify Nazi sympathisers in a British industrial town. Now, long story short, it turns out the key Nazi sympathiser is a member of the British ruling elite, the aristocracy in fact. So, a bit like an Inspector Calls, this novel presents a very negative depiction of a flawed ruling class. But, and this is where it gets all very level 9, you could argue that although there's a negative depiction of the ruling class through unpleasant types like Mrs. Birling in an Inspector Calls, the ruling class in Blackout in Gretly appear even more repellent. Why? Because Priestley suggests that the ruling class and Nazis in his novel, that there's a lot in common. They both, a small social elite maintains its comfortable position by brutalising the poor, the weak, the vulnerable, the masses. So, Mrs. Birling, nasty, sure, but not as nasty as the ruling class in this novel. And that's a really fruitful contextual gem to toss an examiner's way. And I've concertinaed down all those ideas about Blackout in Gretly into this contextual paragraph here. This is the sort of thing that you could lob at an examiner and at least you'd be guaranteed for this section a level 9. Maybe pause the screen for a second or so, have a good gulp at it. Do you know what? I'm all done with Birling bashing now. It's too easy. I mean, there's such a obnoxious brood, as my level 9 insights amply demonstrate. But in the spirit of that level 9 perceptive analysis that the examiner loves, I'm going to show you how it's possible to perceive Mrs. Birling as a figure genuinely deserving of our pity, our sympathy. Rewind to Act 1 and they've just finished dinner and Mrs. Birling says that her and Sheila better go into the drawing room and leave you men. Now this links with another line of dialogue where she's explaining to Sheila that married men can't be as attentive as you want them to be because there are men with important work to do. Now what this illustrates is that Mrs. Birling believes that men and their work is more important, more superior to women. Now to 21st century eyes, that's a very backward, outmoded way of looking at the world. I mean, Mrs. Birling is nobody's idea of Feminist of the Year. I mean, she's got about as much right to that title as Donald Trump. But Mr. Taylor, you jug-eared buffoon, why am I supposed to pity this poisonous woman? That's a good question, and I'll counter it with another question. Do you not find it depressing that this woman seems so complicit in her own subjugation? I mean, she parrots this guff about men being superior to women because she's been raised from birth to perceive her own gender and herself as inferior to the industrious men building businesses and buying homes to keep their women folk comfortable. She's been socially conditioned or culturally indoctrinated to believe men are better. She doesn't seem to appreciate the gender inequality underpinning her life. Apologies for the change of location, folks. Not to mention the light bouncing off my big bald head. That's lockdown, folks. That's nothing I can do about that. Here's your contextual connection that clamps Mrs. Birling's submissive utterance here to issues of gender in the Edwardian era. Her low status, as manifested in this line, parallels the low status of women in 1912. What did they have? Or more specifically, what did women not have back then? No vote, limited access to the labour market. If you're working class, you could get a crappy job as factory fodder, low pay, poor conditions. If you're middle class, maybe it could be a governess. Again, I'm guessing that wasn't film star money either. Either way, no vote, little in the way of independent wealth, no power. With that in mind, it is possible to have a germ of sympathy, a pang of feeling for Mrs. Birling. This is a woman, after all, shaped by male-dominated forces to perceive gender inequality to be as natural as breathing. Listen, buy my book, don't buy my book. All I'm going to say, it worked for my year 11. More 7 to 9s, the emphasis on 8 and 9, than I ever thought possible. It can work for you too. And that's your lot, folks. Mrs. Birling, what a heartless, cold old snob she is. Happy to prioritise manners over morals, feeling no moral obligation to support the poor on account of her unshakable belief that their poverty is self-inflicted, that their wild and wicked ways lead to their destitution. That said, it is possible to have a grain of sympathy for Mrs. Birling. After all, she was shaped by patriarchal society to believe in her own inferiority, purely on account of her gender. Is this the final word on Mrs. Birling? Good Lord, no. But do you know what? I thought I'd make a video 30 minutes long, not 13 stinking hours long. That said, every second that you've sat through has been shot through the sort of level 9 quality that pays out big time in an exam. So, I'm off to get a fistful of biscuits and a flat white. I'll leave you good people to your day. Best of luck in that exam hall.